and give that 10 seconds. Then we're going to go into video. Yes, good morning and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede. It is, of course, July the 8th, and we are broadcasting to you live from BC's northern capital. Before we get too far down the road here, we're, of course, going to do our sponsorship of Resistance Coffee. Resistance Coffee is based out of Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and they have this funny idea that maybe if a corporation does choose to use any of its excess profit for anything, it shouldn't be to curtail your freedoms, it should be to expand them. So whereas other companies are going into woke causes and ideology that tells us that there's no such thing as boys or girls or God knows what else, that's not what Resistance Coffee is about. Resistance Coffee is locally based, it's roasted in Saskatchewan, and it wants to make sure that your freedoms expand, not contract. If you use Western Standard for your first order, you'll get 10% off. So again, that's Resistance Coffee, and they're coming to you live from Saskatchewan. Alrighty, well, we're going to go straight into it. I do not have an opening statement this morning due to the fact that we had some technical difficulties on our end, but thank you for being with us. We're going to have Aaron straight away, and he's going to give us the BC News Roundup. Aaron, it's good to have you back.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Good morning to you. And I'll apologize in advance. TELUS has decided this morning would be a great time to drill some fiber optic into the building that I happen to be in currently. So we'll see how it goes.
I'm sure that it'll all be fine. I'm sure there'll be no noise disturbance or anything else. It certainly won't be smoky outside and hard to breathe. It'll all be great.
Yeah, there won't be any apocalyptic. As long as they don't accidentally cut my Shaw cable, I think then we're probably okay.
That's how they're going to get you into Shaw. That's the way they're going to do that.
Yeah.
So why don't you take us from the top? What's on the docket for today?
Well, it was a fiery week in BC, pardon the pun. I don't have too much on the story of Lytton to go over today, but everybody will be fully aware of that. It's still sort of unfolding what the aftermath of that is going to look like, but as folks know, earlier in the week, British Columbia lost an entire community. I mean, 90% of the town estimated was literally just wiped off the face of the earth in a day. And folks had little or no warning, which is rather concerning. And so, without showing a whole bunch of photos and going through sort of the disaster porn that I think a lot of the media is showing everybody at the moment, the important thing to know is that most of that community has been uprooted. A lot of them have gone to Kamloops and other surrounding areas, which is good. But I think other towns and communities in the interior in British Columbia are going to watch this very closely because it's a little concerning that Victoria, and this isn't a shot at the BC. I'm not saying that Lytton would still be here if the BC Liberals had been in Victoria at the time. What I'm more concerned about is sort of the dynamic between Victoria, irrespective of which government is there, and the focus that's paid on interior communities. And it was just maddening to me that a good number of folks in Lytton didn't know the fire was coming until somebody knocked on their door and said, you need to hit the road now and you don't have time to even grab your shoes. How does that happen in 2021? I know that one of the Indigenous chief counselors in the area, I can't even recall his name now, but I know he's been chief, I think, for over 20 years. He also happens to be a cattle rancher. He was quite incensed because he got a call from one ministry or another, probably the Ministry of Agriculture. And that was the first call he got from any public official, any provincial representative, and they were concerned about his livestock. Nobody called to find out how the citizens of the reserve were doing, or anybody in the nation. So that's a bit concerning. But I think, interior towns that are already a bit wary of, and interior folks, not unlike the fire in Fort McMurray at all, actually. Except, this one hit. If you saw it on the news, it just hit within a day and wiped the town out within a day. It didn't really, and I'm not sure what the status of it is at this point. But interior towns that sort of wonder, are we getting a fair deal from the major population center in the south of the province, and then sort of the separated power center in Victoria? They're going to watch this closely, because there are few indicators more clear that a government has failed utterly than an entire community being wiped off the face of the earth in a day. I spend a lot of time criticizing the BC NDP. This isn't something that I'm specifically criticizing them about. I think it's more of a function of how Victoria relates to the rest of the province. And so we'll see how this one comes out. They're going to have to, British Columbians, I think, want to know why the warning wasn't given much earlier. What kind of systems do we have in place that failed? Or what kind of systems do we not have in place that, like I said, led to this situation where people were getting knocks on the door saying, you need to run now. All of this video that's been shown of people leaving the town, they're driving through like a burning hellscape. It's unbelievable video. And it's just, if you live in Vancouver, it's literally just a couple hours down the road. That was Lytton.
No, I completely agree. It's devastating there's no way of even putting it politely or bluntly or anything else. You just look at the pictures, and the town is gone, like as if it was hit by, some kind of nuclear weapon. It's just been it's been incinerated.
Yeah, and there's I know there was a Chinese museum there that carried a lot of important artifacts. As people know, Chinese people have been in British Columbia for generations. Many Chinese families have been in British Columbia for more generations than my family's been in the province. And there's a lot of good history about the work that Chinese communities did, especially during periods of time when they were subjected to racism, not just from employers, but from the labor movement, from unions, who had a position of Asiatic exclusion at the time, officially, very racist position. And so a lot of that history is just gone, just been wiped out. And Lytton itself was a community that was integral to the history of this province and its development. And so it's, sorry to start off on such a low note, but I think it's important for British Columbians to be angry about this and to demand that some price be paid, some consequences be paid by folks in Victoria for whatever process wasn't in place or wasn't followed. You can't really, it's not like you can blame the wildfire branch. These people are heroes. These are generally young British Columbians who are out in the field risking their lives every day, trying to save folks. But if there was a fire on South Island or anywhere in the Lower Mainland, you wouldn't have seen that kind of delay in the warning. So this is the kind of thing I think we're going to have to watch. Anyway, that wasn't actually one of the main items. The big news item that was playing out while Lytton was burning to the ground, and it was surprising to me that this became such a big news item, but it was over a comment that one British Columbian of note named Harsha Walia made in respect to a Vice article about the spate of burnings of Catholic churches that have arisen, presumably in response to the revelation of a number of what are being termed as mass graves of children on near residential schools. So here it is. Now, for folks who don't know, Harsha Walia, she's fairly well known in British Columbia, mostly in left-wing circles. She is currently the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association. I think she's held that title for a year or two. And prior to that, and maybe she's still involved with it, I don't know, she was the head of an organization, or at least a spokesperson of an organization for many years called No One Is Illegal, which spent a lot of their time advocating for the rights of, undocumented immigrants, but which we don't have as many of in Canada as in the US, but it was more about, I think they advocated more rights for live-in caregivers and healthcare workers and stuff that may or may not have had citizenship. And so she's been a controversial figure for quite a long time. I've known her for a number of years. I think you've even met her on occasion.
Yeah, I met her down when you came and spoke to us at BCFS, or this Federation of Students.
Oh, okay. So she was at the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, she was. Yeah, and
So
George Davis or whatever, or George Davies.
He's actually from Prince George. He's another historian. Sheldon Clare would know him. He's a historian at the college here, but he was head of the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators at the time, so that makes sense. That's why you would have seen him too. Anyway, so she made this comment, which predictably produced a firestorm of controversy within sort of the teapot that is British Columbia. And so I just kind of followed this. I think this came out Monday, and so this response from Claudette is certainly reflective of some of the responses that many of the responses that she received, and it was interesting to me because, like, irrespective of what you think of what she said, it raised an interesting question about free speech, and I think it ends up being a pretty good test for folks who see themselves as free speech advocates, how they respond to a question like this, because this is one of those instances where it really tests your principles when it comes to free speech, because there are a lot of people, and I suspect you're one of them, Nathan, understandably, who are utterly incensed by this comment. And I don't really have to explain why. It's because it looks like she's advocating, or even some people have said inciting people to burn down more churches. So let's I don't know if we can go through some of the different commentary. Well, first of all, just if you're able to find that Aaron Wudrick tweet we can put up. This is the guy who was the head of I think he's currently the head of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, made an interesting comment. I don't know if we can zoom in on that, but am I wrong, or have more people been arrested in Canada this year for going inside a church to worship than for burning one down? I mean, I thought that was an interesting observation. I mean, he's got a good point there. Although the case I think he's trying to make is that for some reason people aren't being charged for these comments, and but I suspect the RCMP are doing everything they can to try to find the people who are doing this. I mean, it's literally arson. So, are the RCMP, is there any evidence that the RCMP is not trying to do what they can and investigate and try to track these folks down? I haven't seen any evidence. I haven't seen anybody claim that they don't think they're doing their job, but obviously people are frustrated that, it's a keen observation that people in Alberta are literally getting arrested for going to church. And to date, no one that I know of has been arrested for all of these churches that are being burned. And of course, a number of politicians came out to condemn the remarks as well. So we can probably find the one first by John Horgan. And just as we're pulling that up, I've got a quote from Mike Farnsworth, who's the BC NDP public safety minister. He was probably the most chastising. He said, "It's just disgusting and reprehensible that somebody who heads up an organization like that," meaning the BC Civil Liberties Association, would make such comments. So very strong words from the BC public safety minister. John Horgan, of course, had this to say. Burning down churches is not the way forward. All places of community worship must be protected. It's only by coming together that we can support one another. Vandalism will not move us forward. Respect and understanding will. This tweet alone generated a lot of criticism from people on the left who have been expressing a lot of concern about the number of children that are being found in graves. There were a few instances of people or organizations trying to defend the comments. And the first one that kind of came out, sort of probably the heaviest hitter that came out in defense of it, was the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, UBCIC, which, to my understanding, is an organization that generally represents sort of the hereditary chiefs around the province and not the elected chief councils. So there's always sort of I think a healthy level of tension between what the UBCIC says and what some other First Nations councils will say, et cetera. So here's their statement. Union of BC Indian Chiefs stands in strong solidarity with Harsha Walia in condemning the brutal, gruesome genocide of residential school system by Canada and Church while Crown stole First Nations land. She's a highly respected and valued ally. We're grateful for her ongoing support and leadership. So this came out, I think, the next day on Tuesday. And for Harshy, I think it was probably a big show of support. And then another example of one of the justifying arguments was from Diana Day, who is a Indigenous activist in Vancouver. And people probably won't know her. She doesn't have a huge profile. She's sort of well known in leftist circles as well. She ran against Melanie Mark for the nomination in Vancouver Mount Pleasant before Melanie Mark was elected. So it was a face-off between the two of them. And Diana Day was seen as sort of the more lefty, kind of radical between the two. And Melanie Mark, of course, ended up winning that nomination and went on to get elected in what is one of the strongest, probably the strongest NDP riding in the province. So here's her effort to try to justify the comments or defend the comments in some respect. Anger is part of the grief process. Our communities need opportunities to express it in healthy ways. Our people are grieving and mourning huge losses that continue to this day. Millennium Scoop, murdered and missing Indigenous women, incarceration rates, understand and respect that. Other arguments that I encountered to try to justify the remarks, and actually, it was interesting. There were arguments made by folks like me, for instance, that were sort of centered around freedom of speech. I can get to that later. I think they're predictable arguments. But I was interested to see whether anybody would justify if somebody was to concede that she was in fact inciting people to burn more churches, which I don't think she was. I mean, I think the grammar of it, and people will roll their eyes at me and say, well, you're just being technical. But the grammar of it doesn't really support the assertion that she was advocating or trying to incite people to burn down churches. I think if she was trying to do that, she would have said burn them all down instead of burn it all down. And she had clarified almost immediately afterwards that she is absolutely not in favor of burning churches down. And by it, she was referring to, in her words, systems of colonialism, etc. So she's talking about burning all of that system down. But of course, when you put a comment like that on an article talking about burning churches, people are going to draw conclusions, especially if there are people that are interested in trying to change the channel on the outrage that people are expressing over the number of graves that are being discovered. And of course, the word discovered is a controversial term as a descriptor of it, because some people also make the argument that this isn't something that is now being discovered. We have known, and First Nations people have known for years that those graves were there. We're just now getting around with the right technology to be able to scan properly to find them. But the argument in favor of what's happening, to try to justify what's happening, as far as I can tell, sort of goes like this, similar to what Diana Day is saying, that people need room to grieve because such an injustice, and they will describe it as a genocide, etc., has been perpetrated against them, and that we shouldn't tone police them, which is, I don't know if this is a phrase that's used on the right. I don't know if you've encountered it at all, Nathan, but
I've heard of it. It's not used by us, it's heard by us.
Yeah. Probably because it's probably thrown at you by leftists who, in cases like this, where you're chastising them for doing or saying something that you think is reprehensible, and what they're basically saying is, look, we're engaging in resistance against what we view to be an oppressive system, and it's not for you to tell us how to engage that resistance. So that's sort of it's also something leftists use against each other. You encounter it a lot, this is what leftists were throwing at Mike Farnsworth and John Horgan when they came out against this statement. They were saying, well, you're just tone policing Indigenous people and that kind of thing. So, and I know even, I agree with you, Brenda, absolutely. I know even Jerry Butts, the guy that got tossed out of the Prime Minister's office over some other scandal, although he might be back in again, who knows. He got into a debate with somebody who was quite incensed about this, and he said something to the effect of, I don't condone it, but I do understand it. And so that set off sort of another, this is after Harsh's comments, but another set of commentary about whether it's even valid to understand it. And the violence sort of keeps continuing, and there are, I don't even know how much, you probably know better than I do. I mean, there's a number of churches now, not just in BC, but across the country, that have been vandalized and or torched entirely. In fact, I think we've even got a video of the most recent vandalization of St. Jude's Parish in Vancouver. It wasn't a torching, but it was what appears to be a couple of younger women throwing orange paint at the church. And the reason this video is so valuable to me as somebody who's observing this is for two reasons. One, it's like, so far as I can tell, the only evidence we have that that people are actually, like, it's the only evidence that we have to try to find somebody who's doing this. But the other part of it that's interesting, I don't know if we have, I don't know if our producer has that video ready to go or not. It's interesting to watch. What's clear to me about this is you don't have to look very closely to see that these are not Indigenous people, right? And this was my contention when this stuff first started happening, was a lot of Indigenous people were getting blamed for this. And some people were coming out to sort of defend the burning, saying, well, like, their children have been killed over generations, that, you have to sort of understand why they're doing it. And my point was, I don't think Indigenous people are doing this. I've seen a number of Indigenous people who spoke out against it, not necessarily the activists in Vancouver, but the Indigenous people that are closest to the churches that are actually being burned, usually the ones that are still on reserve or part of the band council, or even in many cases chief councilors. They're coming out and condemning it, saying, look, these church, like, because they essentially belong to them, right? They're on their land. A lot of them were keeping, like in the one in Kamloops, for instance. I mean, that one, they wanted to keep that there as kind of a statue to their pain and suffering. Like, they wanted it to be this monument so that nobody would ever forget, right? And there's nothing to be really gained, I think, by any Indigenous people burning these things down. And so the only video evidence we have it confirms what my initial suspicion was, which was it's actually rather than Indigenous people, it's actually the children of, upper middle class white liberal elites, probably in the Lower Mainland, running around doing this because they're living out their anarchist fantasies, and they think that doing this is going to incite people to revolt against, who knows what. And I think if the police are able to start finding people who are responsible for this, I think we're going to start seeing, I mean, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think we're going to start seeing that it's actually younger anarchistic white people that are doing this, not Indigenous people. And all signs seem to point to that. But again, I'm curious to hear your take on it. You have a particularly unique perspective on it, I think, and an important one. But for me, this is one of those really difficult tests if you're an advocate of free speech, because a number of people came out and said, she should be fired. She should be essentially canceled for the words that she said. And my position on that is somebody who's, not to the same scale. I mean, I've got like 2,000 followers on Twitter. Harsha Walia's got somewhere in the neighborhood of like 36,000, right? So the so-called Twitter mob that precipitated my dismissal a few weeks ago was probably nothing compared to what she's enduring as a result of this. But a lot of people were calling for, a lot of the same people that called for my dismissal were calling for her dismissal. And so can you describe yourself as a free speech advocate? I get that people want to criticize the comments she made. I mean, people should be free to criticize the comments she made. But can you call yourself a free speech advocate at the same time that you're calling for her to be dismissed? And that's the first question. The second question is this in fact incitement? Because some people are making that case. In fact, I've got there's one more picture of a tweet, I think, and I can't remember the name of the lawyer, but he describes himself as a Catholic out of, I think, Eastern Ontario. And he took issue with another lawyer who appears to be an Indigenous lawyer who, after Harsha Walia made her comments, pledged to defend anybody who had been caught burning down churches. So yeah, here's the tweet. And so this fella in response said, look, what you're saying here is in fact incitement, and I'm basically reporting it to the Law Society, and I'm going to try to get you fired. And so that's what he said. And then if you scroll down, you can see part of what she said. Naomi Sayers is the lawyer. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't get it all there, but yeah, and I'll also help defend anyone charged. But she also says, let me be clear, I would help her burn it all down. So those are the two questions. Is this in fact incitement? Because, I'm one of those guys who thinks that the claims in the U.S., mainly by Democrats, but some Republicans, that the comments Trump made on January 6th were an example of incitement. And I know a number of free speech advocates said, hang on, I mean, he didn't tell anybody to go charge the Capitol. Well, I mean, if you go look at the tape, he kind of did, right? Like, he kind of did. But did he actually mean, break into it and overthrow the government, which is what I think is the necessary test to demonstrate incitement? Well, I don't think he did that. I mean, I don't think he did anything that I haven't done multiple times every time I've been in front of a microphone, in front of a crowd of a couple thousand trade unionists who are on strike or angry about something, saying, let's charge the legislature and show them we mean business, right? But because things worked out the way they did, people wanted to charge him with incitement. So that's the question I think we need to ask ourselves. If we dispute that Trump made insightful comments on January 6th, are we being hypocritical by suggesting that Harsha Walia also made inciting comments on Monday? My answer to both of those is no. And as much as I may find the comments, and particularly in the context she made them distasteful, the freedom of speech has to protect our freedom to speak, whether people who disagree with us like it or not. And that's a principle you sort of have to be unwavering on. So I mean, anyway, that's a lot of talking. I'm interested to get your take on it.
I think that there's a couple of things on my end, and I have to wear a couple of different hats throughout that discussion, because on the one hand, obviously I'm a devout Roman Catholic, and I obviously don't want any of my churches burned. That's not fun, and I don't like that. But at the same time, I'm not surprised at this action. I'm not surprised at it. The narrative that's being put forward by the mainstream media could definitely incite people to violence. That's not surprising. Some of these grave sites were known before. It's just the markers have been lost. And something else that needs to be noted is that while it's still a tragedy, I'm not arguing that for a second, we also need to acknowledge that people would often be buried quite close to where they died. They weren't necessarily shipped home. They weren't shipped home during the Civil War. They weren't shipped home during the First World War. We didn't have the refrigeration to do that. That didn't happen. So those are just statements of fact. It's not to try and belie what happened, and it's not to try and excuse the wrong that did occur inside of the residential school system by individuals who are clearly abusing their positions of power, which was not everybody, but clearly too many. And none is too many in that respect. I admit that. With regards, though, to the question of free speech, for me, one of the problems I have with the Canadian milieu, to use one of your oft-used vocab words, my problem is that in Canada, we just seem to have no way of responding. So somebody can go and say something outrageous, and then outrageous things can even be done. But as soon as you go to defend your own property, or as soon as you put someone under citizen's arrest, or as soon as you detain someone, whatever, you end up having to give an argument like, "Oh, the gun went off in my hand," or "Oh, I mean, he started," whatever. You basically have to lie once you get to your docket and take your stand. And are accused of having used excessive force in this instance, and you don't get to just say, well, I mean, I'm sorry, you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And that's my policy when it comes to most things. I would never start a physical altercation with somebody, but I would sure as heck make sure that it had a conclusive ending. And if I lose in that conclusion, I do. But I didn't start it, but I participated in the energy that was being carried forward. And for some reason, that's the crime in Canada. Not necessarily the incitement, but somehow my response to the incitement. So my latest column, which just went up on the Standard today, I believe, or late last night, was essentially, in as polite a terms as possible, saying, well, so there's been a few church burnings and there's been some vandalism. The congregations have been spoken to by their priests and their pastors, and they've reached out into their congregations and say, is anybody willing to help with security. And those of us, I'm a status Indian, there's people here who are recent immigrants, or other people who are old stock Canadians, it doesn't matter. All these people have stepped forward within the congregation to say, yeah, some of us would even be willing to stay overnight at the church, or to walk around the church, and to use what my doomed attempt in the army was called fire pickets, when you take shifts at night looking for, quite interestingly enough, fires.
It's the same thing trade unions have had to do to protect their offices for decades.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Precisely. So it's the exact same concept, and it's very simple for me. If I come around a corner and I happen to find you in the act of attempting to burn down my church, I mean, I'd probably just chase you off to begin with. You're probably going to be a coward and run away and leave your matches and gasoline and your barbecue lighters there. But in the event that you have some gumption enough to try and continue with your activity, or even get at me during trying to do that, defend yourself and continue to do your whatever you're doing, like, there's going to be an altercation, and at the end of that, somebody is going to be apprehended, right? And that's how it is. And so that was as politely as I could. And I said, and if I've got enough people to apprehend you, I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be the most comfortable time between when I have my hands on you and when I bring you to the local detachment, or wait for the RCMP to show up. I'm 240 pounds. I might just sit on you. That's not going to be comfortable for you. And that's how it is. So go ahead and say it. Go ahead and put it on Twitter. Go ahead and retweet it. Talk about how it'll be a glorious day when we rid the world of, I don't know, all religion or whatever else. Burn it all down. Go ahead and say it. But if you bring the thunder, be prepared for the lightning, right? And that's what it is. Like, we're going to defend what we have, and I'm not going to go out there and cite anything. But if somebody comes out of my property, they're going to get a polite word, then they're going to get a stern word, and then they're going to get an unmistakable reprimand that says, this is not going to continue. That's how it is.
Yeah, I think I've become a bit of a libertarian on these questions as well. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the RCMP, or even if we had a provincial police force, which is my preference, to expect that they're going to be able to watch every church in the province 24/7. And so we certainly didn't expect that in the labor movement when we felt like one of our offices was going to get torched, which has happened many times over the history of the province. So you do have to take those matters into your own hands and take responsibility for the protection of yourself and your organization and the people that are in it. I'm encouraged to hear that some of that's happening, because clearly there's this seems to be ongoing, and there doesn't seem to be an end to it. And it's just so, I mean, it's predictable in the sense that if the people who are doing it are the ones that I think they are, it's exactly the kind of conclusion they would draw, because their analysis of this whole system is completely skewed, and it's skewed along identitarian lines. So these people already have a completely racist worldview. And I'm not talking about Indigenous people, by the way. Marie C. Claire came out and chastised people for doing this, which I think was probably a good thing to do. But it's anyway. I'm glad to hear your comments on it, because it's a controversial issue, but it was one of those instances where I think, your first response right away is to call for this person's head. Let's get them fired. Let's get them out of there. But then, you have to sort of stop and go, and then what? Like, what's that going to change? All you're going to do is it's the same as when it works in the reverse, when the left tries to do this to people on the right, or trans activists try to do it when people are talking about puberty blockers and that kind of thing. It doesn't make that person go away. It doesn't make their opinion go away. In my mind, it's always better to have these kind of like sunlight is always the best remedy for this stuff. You want to know when people have opinions like this so that you can take them on, whether you agree or not. And if you try to remove them from their platform, it doesn't work. So that was why I wanted to bring this up rather than to just show the videos. But anyway, the next item is, people probably don't even know that this happened actually, but a fellow that you've had on the show at least once before by the name of Aaron Gunn finally announced, sort of, that he's going to seek the leadership of the BC Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. And it just sort of fell flat. Mm-hmm. Which was really surprising to me, and I think is a big problem for him. Mm-hmm. Now, those will remember if they saw your previous episode. I mean, Aaron Gunn, I think, has got a fair bit of support. I'm quite excited by his entry. I have been excited by his potential entry for a while, not because I agree with him. Obviously, I don't agree with him on really anything, but I don't think that everybody should see the world the way I do. I think that any society, and particularly our province, has to have a diversity of views that cover the spectrum so that we can balance each other out. I mean, if everybody saw the world the way I did, I don't think it would be a very good place, to be honest. And so I think there's, I think there needs to be conservatives that sort of, moderate some of my most wide-eyed socialist tendencies, and vice versa. And I think Aaron Gunn represents some people in British Columbia, especially conservative-minded folks, that haven't seen any kind of political expression for themselves in the BC Liberals for quite some time. Now, I think there's some nuance to that. There's probably some people who are conservatives who don't feel at home in the BC Liberals, who probably also have some disagreements with Aaron Gunn on a number of things. But he is also not really, he doesn't come across, or at least he's trying to display himself as somebody who's not out of the party establishment. And this was demonstrated. I haven't got anything to show this, but a few months ago, Mark Marison, who is seeking the mayoralty of whatever that word is in Vancouver, he's going to run against Kennedy Stewart. He's the former husband, I think, of former Premier Christy Clark, and a real backroom guy in the BC Liberal Party. He was one of the first people to come out to say, we can't have somebody like Aaron Gunn in the party. He'll just destroy us, kind of thing. And I think Gunn's response was, who? I mean, I don't even know this guy. And everybody who's told me about him, nobody has anything good to say about him. So he's really tried to position himself as counter to the BC Liberal establishment, which is probably a smart move. He's also got a huge social media following comparative to other leadership candidates. And so he's describing himself as the kind of conservative candidate that those disaffected conservatives within the BC Liberal tent can be hopeful about. But he's definitely, what's interesting to me, number one, is that he's really casting himself as a hyper-federalist, which I don't think is a good strategy, because this is British Columbia. And there are people that are really proud of the country, but not that proud. And it's sort of demonstrated.
They're not Canada proud.
Yeah, there's a reason why that stuff does really well, out east, and probably pretty good in Alberta. But in BC, it just it's not that we don't like Canada. That's the position I've always had. It's just kind of we just sort of joined back in 1872 because it was the right business decision that we thought we could make at the time. I agree that it probably was. But we were always just kind of we'll join this as long as it works for us. But you guys just do your thing out there and leave us alone, kind of thing. So he's really tried to. He made his announcement on Canada Day. I think that was mistake number one. In his mind, it made sense. I'm sure in his campaign team, it was there's this attack on Canada Day. People want to cancel it because of the graves that are being found related to the previous item. And he wants us to carve out some space as this defender of the Canadian brand kind of thing, which would make sense if he was contesting the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. In BC, it just kind of falls flat. Let's put the video up that I have of his announcement. I've got it uploaded here, so if you put it on the screen, I'll just hit the play button.
Is there anybody here who's proud to be Canadian? So, sounded like a couple of you, but let's just ask again, see if we can find any more. Is there anyone here who's proud to be Canadian?
So the reason I showed that clip is that it sort of demonstrates, even in his group of hardcore supporters, which they sort of came to a Canada Day barbecue. I don't know if they knew he was going to make this announcement or not. Even they were just kind of yeah. You had to ask him twice. He had to do the Jeb Bush thing where he's please clap.
Yeah. Oh, rough.
And it's not that people are against Canada. It's just it's not what's ever animated British Columbians, right? Because when you say Canada, people think Trudeau, and they think equalization, and they think, well, it's just people that are as far away from us as Japan is, telling us what to do and how to live our lives and what we can't do. And in the case of Alberta in particular, I mean, they're incensed because when it comes to equalization, they put money into Alberta and they've never really got anything, or into Ottawa, and they've never really got anything back from their perspective. So I think it's a mistake for his campaign to try to wrap this Canadian flag around himself. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he's got some data that shows that that's a real demographic that's going to be supportive of him. Then there was, let's put that video up again because I want to show this other clip. This was the other part that was curious to me.
Which is why I've decided to take the next step in seeking the leadership of the terribly branded and soon to be renamed, I think, BC Liberal Party, and ultimately the premier of this party.
But
And I am doing that, before you guys get just too excited, by officially rolling out an exploratory committee, and I hope to have a final decision very, very soon, and one that you guys can all be very excited about.
so, like, that's the clumsiest announcement I've ever heard in my life. So he basically says, I'm announcing that I'm going to run, and to do that, I'm going to start an exploratory committee to decide whether or not I should run. And it's like, he's already had this exploratory committee going for a few months now. Like, what are you waiting for? Everybody else is basically announced. And even Gavin Dew, who nobody probably even knows or has heard of. He's some like youth activist in the BC Liberal. That guy's announced and like is running his campaign. So even the no names have announced, and he's just sort of holding his gunpowder. Nobody knows what for. Like, piss or get off the pot. Sorry if that violates the
doesn't.
YouTube.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
This is Canada.
So I found that to be really clumsy. And then, so the media response, of course, was quite predictable. Nobody covered it except the Western Standard. There was one article in the Western Standard covering his announcement, and literally nobody else covered it.
We have it here. Actually, we can bring it up.
We can, yeah.
We have the one
just to prove that it exists.
An insurgency. It's an insurgency.
That's right. Well, it's not a very well known one. So I guess maybe it's a stealth insurgency still. But I mean, it was good to see I'm not criticizing the Western Standard at all. It was good to see the Western Standard cover this because nobody else did. So I'm sure that Aaron Gunn's team is quite disappointed with this. I don't know if they were trying to raise some attention with it. They're going to have to do another announcement, I guess. I mean, first of all, to clarify whether he's actually running, and second, to try to get somebody to pay attention to it.
Hey, look! Now I know who's in charge of all this stuff. I didn't even know. So Gavin Dew, Kevin Falcon, Michael Lee, Val Littman, and Ellis. Well, I know who Ellis is.
Yeah.
And then Andrew Wilkinson, of course, and then good old Shirley Bond. That's who I ran against back in the day. Yeah. All right, but we'll leave that where it is.
It was a real misfire. And then if you pull up that other article, if you have it, about Jagmeet Singh, because there's this weird correlation between the two. So the Toronto Star, which is a paper I recommend you never read, put out an article, like really nothing more than a fluff piece. Look at this headline. Jagmeet Singh is a TikTok superstar. Here's what that means for the next election.
Wow, that was a slow news day. Oh my goodness.
Well, and don't read the article, but it's literally just like this fluff piece about how, he's got more TikTok followers than anybody else on the trail, and this is going to be a factor and that kind of thing. And, my response to this was, okay, well, if there's actually any merit to this, then we can expect that Aaron Gunn will be the next premier of British Columbia, because his whole campaign strategy is to try to leverage his sizable and comparatively sizable social media base and see if he can turn those into votes. The big problem with these huge social media bases is that only
I love Sheldon.
Yeah,
so
Sheldon's
much.
good. There's only so many people in that following that actually are in your riding that can vote for you. This isn't the United States. When you're voting for a leader, like nobody voted for John Horgan except the voters of Wanda Fuqua. Mm-hmm. And nobody votes for Justin Trudeau other than, I can't remember what riding he's in. Papineau. Yeah. So that's how our system works. And so you've got 1.4 million TikTok followers, half of which are probably in the States, and they followed you because some pop star, or I think Jagmeet Singh did he played a session of some video game. I can't remember the name of it because I don't play it, with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one day. So that probably got him 500,000 TikTok followers or something like that.
Like Animal Crossing or something?
Animal Crossing is a respectable game. This other one they were playing was some garbage game that they probably would never play because they're just not gamers. But the last thing I want to do is offend any Western Standard viewers who happen to play Animal Crossing. That would be.
I see. Yeah, no, that could. Yeah, you sow the wind to reap the whirlwind on that one. That's
right.
Not good.
It's a big game. Anyway, so let's see. I mean, I think this claim about Jagmeet Singh being a real player now because he's got a social media following is not going to mean anything. But then again, I mean, the same challenge exists for Aaron Gunn. He's got to figure out if he's going to have a hope in hell of winning here, of how he's going to translate all of these social media followers into votes. And again, his first hurdle is to convince Liberal Party members to vote for him. That's the first challenge. And it's not a given that a majority of Liberal Party members are on his social media following feed, right?
No, it's not. It's not. I think I hope Aaron can kind of do some course correction here, because I think that as a kind of, if Ellis Ross is kind of like the elder version of an insurgency candidate, like if you're just a bit more sober, have some real world experience, did your time in Victoria, did your time up north, did your time in selectively logging and driving cab, like all sorts of crazy things he's done in his life, and then on top of all that, being in recovery, because he's admitted that too, right? That he was an alcoholic and he's been in recovery for 20 years.
Is an alcoholic, yeah. You never stop being one, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so he's got a really compelling story, right? Like a really compelling story. And what I was hoping, if I have to be so bold, is that if while Ellis was getting more endorsements up here, right, throughout the interior, right, as kind of the interior guy, and then slowly trying to cruise his way down the Fraser and get more, get people on his side, and especially in the Bible Belt and that sort of thing, because hey, like you can't trust the Lower Mainland guys to do this stuff for you. At least where my values are. At least culturally, my values are closer to your values, and you can rely on me. And then finally, I was thinking that Aaron could kind of bring home any sort of insurgency, populist, perhaps culturally conservative, but certainly culturally anti-establishment sort of political leanings in the Lower Mainland or in Victoria, and kind of almost in a sense deliver that for Ellis's campaign. That was kind of the strategy that I would have tried to follow if Aaron could do such a thing. As it is, I don't know what's going to happen for poor Aaron there, because that was pretty underwhelming.
Yeah, the announcement's obviously a misfire. I mean, in his defense, he may have not seen it as an announcement. He maybe, just saw it as like a prelude to an announcement. We'll see. The other challenge for him is he lives in Victoria, right? Mm-hmm. And it's NDP land. So, and he's a conservative candidate in the BC Liberal Party. So, I think he's got a difficult time. His first challenge is to answer the question to any Liberal Party member, like, how are you going to get elected in Victoria? I think his backup strategy, if I was him, I'd be, it probably explains why he's been doing some video work out in the Peace, because he's thinking, well, I can seek a nomination if I'm elected leader in Peace River country, and then I'm assured. But here's the other challenge: if your main campaign plank is hyper federalism, well, Peace River ain't necessarily going to be that friendly to you either.
There's still people up there who still got signs on their lawns that say, Site C's not a done deal. I used to say that all the time to my high Tory friends, very ardent BC Liberals, good Bennett Liberals, right? I just like, Site C's not a done deal. We're going to go up into the hills. We're going to bring our Enfields with us, and you can't take us. And I just get them razzed.
Yeah, I mean, the site, the Peace is a diverse area. Like politically, federally and provincially, it's conservative, but and those signs will be posted by conservatives and lefties alike. Mm-hmm. But it's also it's a pretty militant area. I mean, they don't they don't like Ottawa telling them what to do. And
or Victoria, or Prince George, or
no, I mean there was Weibo Ludwig's crew up there for years. They were, I mean, we don't know for sure, but somebody was bombing the pipelines up there. Like they're the kind of people, like everybody. It's kind of like Prince George. You don't want to go messing around in people's yards because everybody's got a gun, and it's just like if that's his plan, because he knows he can't get elected in Victoria, if he's going to go to the Peace to try to seek a seat there, I don't think the hyper-federalism is going to, especially for a provincial campaign, like people want to know what you're going to do for the province. And in some respect, they want to know that the Premier of British Columbia isn't just going to cozy up to Ottawa. I mean, that's sort of, that's the problem that Aaron O'Toole is facing right now. And it looks like Aaron Gunn is going to go down the same path. So it's a bit of a misfire. I hope he is able to pick it up. But I also agree with you. I think the best chance for him, if things don't turn around, is to endorse Ellis Ross if he steps down. And I'd love to see the two of them get elected, and that would sort of guarantee him a cabinet post, I guess, if they're able to form government. And that would be interesting. And that would probably be a good move for the BC Liberals if they're interested in trying to keep the tent together and not allow the kind of division that is inevitable when you start going down the identitarian path that they have, which sort of sparked off with their expulsion of Laurie Throness in the middle of the last election. So we'll see. More on that. I see we're running out of time, so I'll jump on to the next item here quick.
For sure. Yeah, no, I would like to get Aaron on here. I don't know if I'm going to get all the leadership candidates on here, because I mean, I'll say this: we've had some pretty heavy opinions said on the show about certain leadership candidates, otherwise known as Kevin Falcon. So what I should really do is I should get James to guest host while I'm gone for my honeymoon, and he can talk to Kevin Falcon for me, and I don't have to listen to that or stream it. Where I'm going, there's no internet, so that'll be fine.
All right, let me talk to Kevin Falcon.
yeah, that'll be great. Let's see. What would you like to bring up next year?
Well, the only other thing now in the news is that I wanted to bring up was the BC NDP constituency assistants have voted, I think, 97% to go on strike, which is kind of interesting. So people will look at this, and this will probably be quite confusing for a lot of folks, like who don't necessarily understand what constituency assistants are. They're not. What's important for people to understand is they're not what I would consider to be like overpaid, underskilled political hacks that work for political parties and work for caucus in Victoria. They are the worker bees that work in the constituency offices in your area. They're usually the people you meet when you go into an MLA's office. They're the ones that do all the work locally, working on case files, trying to get you some assistance when you're trying to navigate the bureaucracy of government. They do all the work, and the MLA basically gets all the glory. And by comparison, they kind of make peanuts. So their collective agreement, you can see it. It's posted on the BC Collective Agreement database. They make between about $26 and $32 an hour, which is not too bad. It's based on experience, but it's a range of 8 to 16% less than what the federal constituency assistants make for federal parties. This is their collective agreement. So you can go through here and just see all of their terms and conditions. They're represented by the BCGU, which used to be called the British Columbia Government and Services Employees Union. And full disclosure, I used to work for that union a number of years ago. They've recently changed their name to the BC General Workers Union, I think. And so now, just because they got a 97% strike vote, which is, that's high. When I was arranging strike votes in a past life, I never wanted to get a 100% strike vote, because then the vote wasn't anonymous. The employer would know who voted in favor of the strike. So you always want to get as close to 100 as possible without actually hitting it and keep the vote anonymous. But it's a high vote. It doesn't mean they're going to go on strike right away. What it means is that they're going to go into mediation first, but they've got, sort of as an additional bargaining chip, this strike mandate in their pocket if mediation breaks down. So that's 57 constituency offices across the province, 12 of which are on the island, because it's NDP land over there. The interesting thing is that they're the only ones that are unionized. The Green Party constituency assistants and the obviously the BC Liberal Party constituency assistants are not unionized. So if you were to try to conclude from this development that it's only the BC NDP constituency assistants that are cranky at the moment, it's not necessary. You can't necessarily draw that conclusion. The other two parties' constituency assistants don't have the legal ability to go on strike because they don't have a union. But if the constituency assistants are able to get the 8 to 16% pay increase, which they're asking for, which would give them parity not just with the federal CAs, but also with the caucus staff that work in Victoria. So the people that are working closer to the ministers in Victoria, you'd probably see a similar increase in pay for the BC Liberal CAs and the Green Party CAs because it's just sort of the way industries work. So everybody is kind of set to benefit from it. But the other thing they're asking for in addition to the pay increase is job security provisions as well. And so this is the thing that sort of caught my attention because I think this is a tougher one for the public, if the public is paying attention, to really to really take seriously. The complaint is if a MLA resigns and a new MLA comes in from the same party, the constituency assistant has to rebid on their job like everybody else does. So what they're asking for is some provision that would give them preferential treatment for job security that span those two MLAs. Of course, if a NDP MLA loses an election and a BC Liberal comes in, there's no job security provision for them at all because no BC Liberal is going to hire a former. I mean, they can. There's nothing saying they couldn't, but it's not likely to happen. I don't think I'm really in favor of this. I think if it's the kind of job that you go into. It's not meant to be, no political job is meant to be a career. A lot of them have turned into careers. That's not a good thing, I think, from the perspective of the public. I'm obviously in favor of the public service having job security, of having lifetime staff people that work in ministry offices, et cetera, that kind of thing. But I don't think it's a good idea to shift to this situation where if you're an MLA, a new MLA coming into an office, that a collective agreement sticks you with this constituency assistant. Because what if it's a terrible constituency assistant? What if the whole constituency hates that person because they're not friendly when they come in the door, or they don't think they're competent in dealing with their case files, et cetera, and you're a new MLA coming in, your political fortunes are sort of tied to this person. So that's a tougher one to get your head around. I think we'll see if they get anything out of it. But one to watch anyway, because the obvious consequence, if they're not able to reach a deal in mediation, is that none of the NDP MLAs have constituency offices available to the public for the duration of a strike.
I think on my end, I have no problem with the idea of people agitating for higher wages. That makes sense. It's a gruesome job sometimes. I mean, you are dealing with you're the reason that the elected member doesn't have to deal with everybody. That's really your job. So you're playing referee, you're playing triage, you're playing the stop before they get to the big guy in the back. That's your job. And that can be a tough job. It can be a tough job calming people down. It can be a tough job hearing, everybody's complaints. Yeah, the buffer. And I think that that's worthy of some decent pay, especially for the competency that comes with it. I would completely agree with you that there's no way to ensure that people in when a new MP or a new MLA shows up, they're going to bring in their favorite people. That's what they're going to do, and it's also the people they trust. It's not just patronage for patronage sake. If I got elected tomorrow, I mean, our producer, who shall remain unnamed, would be the guy that I'd name to be in charge of a lot of my staff. I trust him very much, and I know that I can rely on him, and I'm not going to let some collective agreement stand in my way between getting elected and putting the guy that I trust in charge. So I hear you there.
Yeah, and there's just a bit of delay on your mic. Sorry to take so long to respond. The other interesting piece, just for folks that live in Prince George, because I know that you got to bring Stuart on in a second here, is that the BC NDP caucus director, just out of interest, who would be sitting across the bargaining table from the union in this regard, happens to be Roseanne Moran, who is the daughter of the famous social worker in Prince George, Bridget Moran, of whom there is a statue depicting her likeness. I think it's on 3rd Avenue, sitting on a bench. At least I think it's still there. I don't think anybody's tore it down yet. So it's just an interesting local connection. But those are the news items for this fiery week in British Columbia, and it's always been a pleasure to bounce them off of Western Standard viewers and get their take on it. I find the feedback really valuable.
No, absolutely, and I'm excited for what's going to develop from here. I mean, hopefully Aaron's bid goes somewhere. Hopefully churches stop being burned. Hopefully we get a handle on our wildfire situation here in British Columbia. It's a rather smoky day in Prince George. So you can go outside and take a breath of fresh, smoky air if you need it. But it's like anything. It's going to be up and down. Actually, just before you go, Aaron, what do you think do you think the election's going to be soon federally, or do you think it's going to be a little ways off?
Well, I mean, I think conservatives who are concerned that it's going to happen, they got good reason to be concerned. All the indicators kind of show that he wants to pull the trigger now. And why wouldn't he? Aaron O'Toole is just not performing. And the Conservative Party doesn't seem to have any ability to be able to dislodge him and put somebody else in place. And even if they did, I mean, who would it be, really? So, he's out there getting his picture taken at graves by residential schools with teddy bears and stuff like that. The NDP is, I mean, sure, Jagmeet Singh's got a TikTok following, but like I said, I mean, I don't think they're going to do much better. So yeah, they're basically having the same internal process, I think, that the BC NDP was having prior to the 2020 election, which is, it's never going to be a great time to hold an election, but it's probably going to get worse. So now might be the time. So I think they're, especially as we get closer to, and that's, I think, why you're starting to see, some efforts to try to lift some of the restrictions, is so they don't have to deal with the same backlash that the BC NDP got, that you're throwing us into this unnecessary election in the middle of COVID. But if you're looking at what's happened in California, I mean, the state governor, I think they're just reinstituted mandatory masks in all public buildings, et cetera, again. And so there's going to be this increasing pressure as the professional managerial class, who's not quite yet ready to let go of the restrictions and the power they have from those lockdowns, to try to reinvigorate this stuff as some of the variants take hold. And some people who have been fully vaccinated start to come down with COVID, which is happening in limited numbers. It puts them in a tough spot. But I think they're going to ultimately, I think they'll make the same decision that John Horgan did, which is it's not perfect now, but it's not going to get better. So let's pull the trigger.
I understand. Well, hopefully we can move forward. God help us all. But thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
We'll see you again next week.
Absolutely. I'll enjoy the rest of the show. Absolutely.
Well, we're going to go right into it with our favorite omnicide observer and, all things general, from the space lizards to the Babylonian captivity. It's Stuart Parker.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing well. And if I have to take a pulse on how you're doing, I either look outside to see where the smoke is coming from, which is clearly your ears, or I look at your Facebook, which is also full of wrath and fury. Where are we at today, Stuart? Are we doing okay?
Well, so we've had the hottest days, unprecedented wildfires. Lytton was incinerated in a few hours. Now that made news all over the world, but according to John Horgan, these fatalities are, they're just just a part of life, right? A child watching his two parents be incinerated by a blaze that the government did not warn the citizens of. They just warned ranchers. So everybody with cattle who could have been killed by the Lytton blaze was warned by the Ministry of the Solicitor General. In fact, the only way that the reserve was able to develop evacuation plans was because some of them are cattle ranchers. And had so many people in the reserve not been cattle ranchers, more people would have died. Now, It's like, oh, we have wildfires every year. Actually, no, this is an unprecedented wildfire season. 285 wildfires burning simultaneously at the beginning of July. That's unprecedented. The temperatures, unprecedented. But I know that a bunch of the viewership of this show go, no, it's always been 50 degrees in Lytton. We've always had weekends where 1 billion individual marine life forms were killed by extreme heat. 1 billion, just a billion animals in the intertidal zone, perfectly normal. And I know that I'm going to be arguing with those people when there's a fire tornado in town. I know I'm going to be arguing with those people. They're going, there's always been a typhoon season in Prince Rupert. There's no actual amount of extreme weather that's going to convince a climate denier at this point. Now, what's interesting is Justin Trudeau, who has been saying climate science is settled science, his response to the Lytton Blaze was to change his mind. He no longer believes climate science is settled. That's interesting. Because perhaps people might scrutinize their policies. Now, John Horgan is always the guy who is going to, I think for people who wanted Doug Ford to be a Donald Trump-like character, you should just keep your eyes on John Horgan. The only reason he doesn't seem like Donald Trump to you is because he's with the NDP. But he has all the right personality architecture, all the right indifference to suffering for people who want to be shocked. And so, of course, we saw all over the world, the rest of the world was shocked by the kind of stuff John Horgan had to say about the deaths and the extreme heat and not warning the people of Lytton. He's a New Democrat, so he must be valuing human life too much. It's like, no, this guy really doesn't. I don't think he cares whether anybody lives. I don't think he cares whether he lives or dies, honestly. But what was striking was the provincial government's response, that they announced new climate policy in response to the disaster in Lytton. And I don't think it will surprise any longtime observer of the BC NDP that although it's covered in gobbledygook and hogwash and nonsense, the actual announcement is they're going to increase fracking subsidies. So their response to the climate emergency is, again, to just hammer the gas into the floor as we go over the cliff. See if we can burn it all up 2 years earlier. That's the response. And it was announced by the Minister of Climate Change, or the Minister of Fire, I guess we should call him now. Joyce Murray was briefly the Minister of Fire under Campbell. I don't see why we can't have another one. But George Heyman, he's the one who puts out this nonsense press release, which is supposedly about hydrogen fuel cell technology, until you start reading it and you see that it's just full of euphemisms for fracking. The BC government thinks it can save the fracking industry in the Northeast, not just by showering money on it, as it does to the tune of about $1 billion a year now. They're also going to increase it by claiming that they're going to use fracked gas to make hydrogen fuel cells for zero-emission hydrogen trains that don't run anywhere, right? There are no zero-emission hydrogen trains in the Western Hemisphere because it's a stupid technology. It was like a clever technology in the 90s when, things were different. We didn't know as much. And honestly, our batteries were worse and our solar was way worse. And back then, hydrogen fuel cells made tiny, tiny amounts of sense. I remember the last NDP government under Glenn Clark was really into hydrogen fuel cells. There was this company called Ballard Power that was given millions of dollars by the government, mainly to hold press conferences about things they never built. And but Ballard Power, somebody finally said, well, how are you going to power this thing? You're just going to use fracked gas. And the Ballard Power guys were like, no, we're going to put a breeder reactor in the trunk of every car. And then people went, whoa, maybe we shouldn't do business with these people. However unsafe, you might find petroleum, and God knows I do. Just imagine like vehicles rear-ending each other and suddenly, oh dear, there's a critical mass. We're going to have a small mushroom cloud over the intersection. Anyway, this is the kind of bright idea we associate with the hydrogen power. to give, I mean, again, another harbinger of the times, the only person of any public significance who's been shilling for hydrogen in the past 5 years is Van der Zand. Now I love me some Van der Zand. Bill Van der Zand was a very, very entertaining individual. And, you know, if I were electing someone to have drinks with every Friday night, of course I'd pick the Zam. But in terms of like rational public policy, that's not really what we go to that guy for. You know, he's into chemtrails now, right? He's trying to stop the mind control planes that are flying over us. And so he's the only publicly prominent hydrogen shill until George Heyman comes along with this half-baked scheme to save North Haverbrook, Ogdenville, and are those real towns? It sounds like it sounds like something someone would make up about Ontario.
John's just messing with you, I bet. It's just throwing a stick in your spokes.
Those are not real towns there. You know, but on the other hand, my friend Steve and I used to think John Tory was a hypothetical construct too. Like now he's the mayor of Toronto, but I always thought it was like, what does John Tory think? I had no idea it was like an actual person's name. And then when you meet him, he's exactly like a hypothetical construct. He's like grown in a vat that's been trying to produce John Tory for the past 100 years. So, you know, he's anyway, zero emission hydrogen trains. There's one in Germany and it goes. But honestly, you know what I've discovered, right, is that when you actually start crunching the numbers and you go, how many years has this party been in government? And, oh, the monorail. And more importantly, Sheldon, we all know where that goes. The escalator to nowhere. I'm holding out for that one. So the thing is, if you actually look at the record of different parties in government, it's the exact inverse of their public rhetoric. So the Green Party has only been in government for 3 years in Canada during its coalition with John Horgan. And that government had the distinction of increasing fracking emissions and fossil fuel subsidies by more per year than any other government in Canadian history. So in terms of legislative record, the Green Party is the single most effective party at increasing carbon emissions. Who's second place? The NDP, right? John Horgan was able to increase emissions by more per year and subsidies for fossil fuels by more per year than Christy Clark or Gordon Campbell. In fact, in terms of subsidies, he increased subsidies to big oil by 3 times as much in 3 years than what Christy Clark and Gordon Campbell combined had done in 16. And so consequently, of course, emissions rise faster under an NDP government. The same is true of Rachel Notley. Right? One of the reasons she's ahead of Jason Kenney in the polls is that for all his bluster, he doesn't get pipelines built. He doesn't get wells sunk. He shouts at people. That's his thing. So if you want someone to shout about how we need to burn it all up, obviously vote Tory. But if you want someone to actually get the job done, if you want someone to actually fry this planet, then vote left. They'll buy you pipelines. They'll hand $6 billion to Royal Dutch Shell. They'll do whatever it takes. Whereas conservatives fundamentally are simply less competent at massive environmental destruction. So I might vote Tory, just trusting that my MP will not be able to cause the destruction he's hoping to cause. Whereas, you know, if the polls are so bad for Aaron O'Toole right now, the Liberals could win this seat or the NDP. Like Prince George could be a 3-way race in the federal election. That's how bad Aaron O'Toole is doing right now. And, you know, I think that there are just 2 different conversations. And this is part of the problem with this woke moment we're in. Nobody actually wants to talk about what's happening in the world. People want to talk about the conversation about what's happening in the world, right? That's why, you know, look at the comparative cases of Michael Bryan and Harsha Walia. Now, Harsha Walia, head of the BC Civil Liberties Association, who, you know, made the mistake of saying, burn it all down in reference to, I guess, colonialism when a bunch of people were burning things down. And I don't think Harshawalia actually physically wanted to burn things down. I just think that she was immoderate in her speech. But the point is, Jonathan Kay is on her case. Everybody's on her case, and she's like hiding from the media. And everybody's like, we've got to stop the subsidies to the BC Civil Liberties Association. This is appalling. Well, who the hell is the head of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association? Well, he's my former MPP from when I lived in Ontario. He was Ontario's Attorney General until he murdered a man in cold blood in front of witnesses, right? He got into an altercation with a cyclist when he was driving his car, and the cyclist was like yelling at him and held onto the side of his car, and his solution to the problem was to go into the median and scrape the cyclist off his car using speed and concrete and metal. And so he killed the guy, killed him. He could have just, stopped the car, run away, whatever. Chose to kill the guy, hired Navigator, the greatest reputation management firm in the world. And what do you know? They relaunched him within 2 years as the head of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Who the hell has said this is grotesque? How can you have a guy who murdered an impoverished Indigenous cyclist in cold blood in public? How can he be the head of the Canadian? But nobody says that. Do you know why? Because Michael Bryant has never written a mean tweet about poor Indigenous cyclists. He's only killed one with his hands. So naturally, Michael Bryant's fine. Nobody's calling for his resignation. There's never been a campaign to get rid of Bryant. But Harshawalia, she sent out an immoderate tweet. So we're going to light our hair on fire about that, because we don't give a damn what happens in the world. We just care what happens in the conversation about the world.
I want to refer back to this question of why are conservatives less efficient at building pipelines and God knows what else. I think that maybe some of it has to do with is it really as old as like the enclosure laws, and it was really kind of the radicals who were in favor of enclosure when the conservatives maybe couldn't have given a rip? And does it go back to Manchester liberalism? Does it go all the way back to, like, you have the zealots in your populace, which are usually to the left, and then you have the guys kind of sauntering along waiting for their next coffee break, and then they go and they kind of do some work, I guess. They got to be productive sometime. They have lunch and then they have another coffee break and then they go home. Is that really what it is? A cultural difference of, like, in conservatism, the idea that it might take a while to get there and we're not really worried about it, compared to the on the left, a more ardent sense of urgency? Does that what it boils down to?
It's not the same kinds of people in the left or the right today. Most of the people who would have been in the right 100 years ago identify as left. Most of the people who would have identified as left 100 years ago are on the right today. Right? If you think things are bad and you're quite angry about it, you're probably on the right. If you think people need to be more polite and show greater deference based on social rank, you're probably on the left. That was only oh wow, I had no idea that, like, TED has gone from being like a somewhat entertaining thing to look at to, it's like now I see TEDx anything and I run. Like there is some,
it's like neoliberal porn.
Yes, yeah, it's so weird. That stated, if you go back and look at John Hodgman's Love and Aliens TED Talk, it's still a damn good talk. It's still worth it. But you meet people, and there's like TEDx everywhere, right? Like there's I think when I encountered the coordinator of TEDx Everett, that old pulp mill town in Washington, I thought, this TED thing is out of control. Anyway, anyway, on this question of why, so I don't think it's a cultural thing, because I think you're describing how Tories were, not how Tories are. And like, in terms of like hysteria and panic and desperation, I don't think there's a premier in this country that does that as well as Jason Kenney. Everything is on fire all the time. Everything is always being screamed about. Everything is an emergency. And Jason Kenney has a great personal talent for turning things that are merely problems into emergencies. And I think that's more the problem, that what Tories had this problem of today of having trouble making deals with go along, get along guys. And that's what John Horgan is, right? He's a go along, get along guy. He's not an alpha male by any means. He's just like a blustery toady. But the thing is, if, right, the NDP and Liberals can make a deal with each other to build a pipeline, because they'll all stand there and go, we are building this pipeline to stop climate change. And their base is happy, their constituency is happy, they've agreed upon a line, they cut the ribbon. Whereas that's not what Tories do in this country. They've become bad at coalition building. When is the last time you saw Tories being able to run a minority government? It's Harper. And Harper ran those minority governments through fear and intimidation. He never built a stable coalition. He was never able to sign a deal with another party. Tories are so culturally isolated that the other parties, they can make deals with each other. They can make deals with each other because they're just different wings of the same people. Greens, Liberals, New Democrats, there's no significant cultural difference or ideological difference. And they all understand that their policies are a grift. They're fake. They're there because people want to hear that those parties care about those things. And that, I think, is the other problem Tories have with making deals to get things done. Canadians want to pretend to care about climate change. They don't want to care about climate change. They would never vote en masse for a party that was actually going to do something. But they want to pretend they care. And Tories have adopted such a misanthropic rhetoric that people who want to pretend to care about things that the Tories don't care about, there's no way to pull those people into the discourse. Aaron O'Toole, I think, too, tried to do that on climate, and he has screwed up at every stage. He's alienated his base. He's disgusted swing voters. He's done it completely wrong. But I think the Tories are simply boxed in culturally, and they're boxed in because of cultural changes that are primarily driven by the United States, not by Canada. There is a larger Anglo-American move to define urban people as progressive and rural people as conservative. So unless you have the ability to gerrymander your ridings the way Americans do, it permanently backfoots Tories because their base is a shrinking demographic, and it's in seats where they pile up gigantic 80% majorities. So anyway, I think the problem is Tories, unless they get majorities, really can't proceed with what they'd like to do. The other thing, though, is I would say the spite factor. This used to be a thing you only saw in Quebec. So, the Montreal subway system, whenever the PQ would get into power, they would start digging a tunnel under the river to get the subway to the island of Laval. And then the Liberals would get into power, and instead of leaving the tunnel there or finishing it, they would fill it up out of spite. And then the PQ would get back in. They'd dig all the fill out and start on the tunnel again. And the Liberals would get back in. They'd fill the tunnel back up. Filling the tunnel back up slows you down. It expends resources in inefficient ways because you're just trying to screw the other guy for no apparent benefit. And so Doug Ford might have been, if Doug Ford had simply invested in fossil fuel subsidies the way John Horgan did, then maybe Ford would have been able to increase emissions in Ontario the way they've increased in BC. But he felt it was really important to pay $110 million to dismantle wind turbines. And that money just goes away. They were dismantled out of spite. I mean, I understand that there's a small number of Donald Trump followers who believe you can get windmill cancer, but there is no such thing as windmill cancer. And Doug Ford knows that. That was 110 million in spite dollars. And again, I think this has more to do with cultural problems, right? The new kind of spite-based right that was developed in the United States is also just a poor fit for Canadian culture, because Anglo-Canadians are not a particularly ornery bunch. And those that are, you know, largely in like peripheral rural areas. They're not an important bunch. I mean, there are a lot of ornery Americans. We've been breeding orneriness into the United States. We've got to remember that both Canada and the US were created by the American Revolution. And the fundamental baseline of Canadian culture is Upper Canada. And Upper Canadians are people who moved from all kinds of nice places all over the United States to live on the North Shore of Lake Ontario in the 1780s because they hated freedom so much that they could not abide living in a democracy. And that's our starting point. In many ways, the American right has never been conventionally conservative, has never come out of that old Tory tradition. Whereas the normative culture of Canada is old school Toryism, old school British imperial Toryism. Now, today we call old school British imperial Toryism progressivism. That's the name for knowing your place, knowing society is hierarchical, being mannerly, practicing noblesse oblige if you're rich, ghettoizing minorities into geographic spaces, all that stuff. There's a whole package of what British imperial Toryism is, and it's what Canadians have actually come to believe in more since I've been born. It used to be that was like an Ontarian way of thinking about the world, or a Maritimer way of thinking about the world. In many ways, the cities of the West have really adopted that way of thinking about the world. The countryside, not so much, but the cities of the West, they're old school Tories. And when you see, Andrew Weaver and John Horgan shaking hands, right? That's just old school Toryism. That's just some go along, get along guys figuring out how to help the establishment more. And so I think in many ways the Tories' bed is really made for it, that we need actually a revolution in media consciousness in Canada before we can actually de-link ourselves from the dysfunctional politics of America. As long as the left is getting most of its news from The Tonight Show and the right is getting most of its news from Fox News, Canadian politics is being framed by American talking heads. It's not being framed by our sad excuse for a national broadcaster.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that fundamentally. The question then becomes very much so what's going to happen in this upcoming election? There's clearly an election's coming down the pipe.
Oh, absolutely.
What's going to happen?
Oh, I think we know what's going to happen. There's going to be a Liberal majority government. I've been looking at the polls. The Tories are in third in BC. Worse yet, Alberta and Saskatchewan look like three-way races. The Tories are barely ahead in Alberta, barely ahead in Saskatchewan, and they're having their clocks cleaned everywhere else. It is possible that Aaron O'Toole could rally during the debate. If the Tories have any sense, they should massively reduce expectations about O'Toole in the debate. They should take the one advantage they've been handed, which is that everybody already thinks they're going to screw up. So everybody already thinks the Tories are going to screw this up. So they should do what Justin Trudeau did in 2015. They should ride those low expectations. And then when people see that Aaron O'Toole is a smart, quick-witted man, more quick-witted than Jagmeet Singh or Justin Trudeau, they've got a small chance of rallying. But I wouldn't say it's good. There are some other fundamentals that are looking really bad for them. I know that these things aren't supposed to matter, but the NDP was awfully smart getting the only leader they could possibly find who was taller than Justin Trudeau. People feel secure the NDP won't form government, and that means that their vote is rising in all kinds of people who just want to send effective opposition MPs from the West to Ottawa. So in the industrial towns in Ontario and in most of the West, people are like, you know what? Jagmeet Singh will do a better job as opposition leader than Aaron O'Toole, which is a perfectly reasonable assessment to make. And Singh has invested heavily in distancing himself from the anti-pipeline positions he rode to gain the leadership, right? Anne McGrath has been his chief of staff. Right, she succeeded Brian Topp as Rachel Notley's chief of staff when she was premier, and McGrath has poured work into getting petro workers in Saskatchewan and Alberta to give Singh a second look, and that's working. That's working. His numbers are good, and we also have to remember that people get overtaken by these urban narratives about the problems of being a Sikh candidate, a turbaned Sikh candidate at that. But we forget that in communities like Prince George and Williams Lake and whatever, Sikhs are what we would call a model minority, the way Americans think about Chinese people. So in any town with a mill, right, Sikhs have a reputation of being self-disciplined, hardworking people. It's stereotypes they have in rural Canada as opposed to urban Canada. Lots more negative stereotypes in urban ridings. In BC, not so much industrial towns in Ontario or industrial. Singh's going to look more like the pre-1993 NDP. I think Singh will recover the old Ed Broadbent base. That's what his numbers look like right now. First in BC, first in Saskatchewan, second in Manitoba, third in Ontario, total wipeout everywhere else. That's your old NDP pattern. I think he's going to do fine. Now, Justin Trudeau is pretty smart on this in that he is essentially what's happened is Justin Trudeau had two key advisors until 2019, Chrystia Freeland and Gerald Butts. Gerald Butts had to resign over the WE scandal, and Trudeau did something very smart, which is to say, yeah, Chrystia Freeland really is in charge. And that's effectively what he's been presenting. Hey, I'm the front man. This is the actual prime minister. I think that in the this day and age of identity politics, there are all kinds of idiots on the left who are going to vote for probably the most right-wing member of his government because she's female. But he's also allowed her to produce a fig leaf by rolling out national child care. So the Liberals are the Liberals have been promising a national child care program in every election since 1984. That's not new. What is new is that they're doing some of the spending before the election in an attempt to demonstrate good faith. So I think childcare is going to help. I think Trudeau is going to come back with a huge majority. It's going to be like Chrétien's third term or Trudeau Sr.'s third term. He'll come back with an absolute juggernaut. I was very interested to see that initially the feds wanted to fight the election on social issues. So it was going to be the hate crimes bill, the conversion therapy bill, all that stuff, all this free speech suppression, go to jail if you misgender someone, go to jail if you say something mean about the government of Israel, go to, all that sort of stuff. They've now realized they have to downplay that. They can see that they can't win this thing just on social issues, that in fact their polls are showing them what I know the polls are showing them, which is that a lot of these social issues are a bridge too far for them. A lot of these social issues are too weird or just not interesting to enough people. And so moving from the social issues to childcare is really intelligent. And they'll run the childcare election like they did in '93. And I think they'll do pretty well at it. Now, in my line of work right now, I'm doing some work on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And what I can tell you is they were probably hoping for, when they were going to do social issues, they were going to much more prominently feature redoing the Missing Women Commission again, just so they could consult more. They're going to pour money into more consultation and more of the Indigenous the Indigenous consultant industrial complex that I'm now at the periphery of. Again, they've realized that that too many mass graves, this is too incendiary, this could turn on them, especially because there are now more reserves with boil water advisories than there were when the Liberals took power. So let's be clear that the thing they promised to fix is like everything else they promised to fix. They've made it worse. The climate, Indigenous drinking water, you name the metric, they have made Canada worse. And but again, Canadians don't want to treat Indigenous people fairly. They want people to think that they want to treat Indigenous people fairly. And Trudeau will get that job done. That guy can cry on a dime. That's the main skill, really, he's brought to the prime ministership, is the crying on cue. But I think they're going to keep the crying a little more under control. I think they're going to try and tell people that, look, there are going to be some improvements in your childcare, and that's going to play with all the families that had to do extra childcare because of COVID. You just keep hammering, look, we'll take your kids off your hands for a few hours. That sells pretty well to this nation's parents after a year of intermittent school closures, fear of schools, not being able to send your kids out into the world.
If that happens, and I don't think you're wrong about any of that assessment, Stuart, but if that happens, is that going to break the Conservative Party as it stands today? Is that going to finally break the consensus and then start another reform period and another alliance period and another unification period?
That's possible, but of course, the thing to remember is that Reform did not initially appear as a social conservative party or as a fiscal conservative party. They entered the 1988 election as a sectional party. Their original slogan in '88 was, "The West wants in." So we have to remember that as much as the Christian right was a big part of Reform's foundation and a much abused part of the foundation, they were not the bedrock. Separatists, soft separatists and sovereigntists in the West were the bedrock. And the Bloc and Reform came into being at basically the same time because of sectional issues. So the danger is it's not going to be this coalition isn't working for people of the right. It's going to be a question of can there be a sectional party that creates a regionally viable kind of Toryism. And that's obviously in the hands of the people running this channel and people near them and like them. And I don't really know how that's going to go. But what I do know is that I can't think of any other way of building the party without building a new party without it being immediately branded as so extreme that it's outside the discourse. Look at Maxime Bernier, right? The networks did everything in their power to make the People's Party look like a mainstream party in 2019. They completely rewrote all of their debate eligibility rules to seat Bernier in the debate. And ultimately, the guy got 1.5% of the vote. He got a smaller portion of the vote running in the whole country than Preston Manning did running in a third of the country on his first try. So Bernier, so I think the People's Party is really a sign of the fact that one of the few things the Tories in Canada have going for them is support from Post media, Black Press, Glacier, all the big media conglomerates always endorse the Tories. And those media companies have no interest in an ideological split within the Tories. A sectional split is something they could handle. And so you've got to put section before ideology, which is, of course, dangerous, right? Once again, you're submerging the Christian right, and you're submerging libertarians. But honestly, folks, this is why the original electoral reform movement in this province was overwhelmingly driven by the right, not the left. I was there. We put these agreements together. And sure, I was the leader of the Green Party, but one of the reasons I was the public face of the movement in the 90s is because the Taxpayers Federation, the Family Coalition Party, the Christian Heritage Party, all those folks were most of the membership. And they needed people on the left to show it was a cross-partisan endeavor. But honestly, conservatives have got to deal with the ideological conservatives who don't fit with the conservative brokerage politics of a national Tory party. You've got to recognize the only way you're going to get your wish is proportional representation. You can't get what you want under first past the post. And you can look all over the English-speaking world to see the same problems in Tory movements there, right? There, you have the same kind of national brokerage, incoherent Tory party in Australia. You have the same kind of national brokerage, incoherent Tory party in England. The only way that the far right gets representatives in the English Parliament, Nigel Farage tried all those times, never once got a seat in Westminster, but he continuously had a seat in the European Parliament, which was selected by proportional representation. The only far-right people in Westminster are the Democratic Unionist Party, i.e. a Northern Irish sectional party, right? Regionalism is you can either use regionalism or you can use proportional representation. Those are your two choices. And Tories right now they've just got to grow up about that. It's like either you change the voting system, or you're going to strap your ideas to a regional project. Though those are your only shots. Tell me I'm wrong anywhere. Look at India, for God's sake. Look at any Westminster system under first past the post. There's not going to be a family values party in Parliament.
Well, I've often wondered if Canada shouldn't be, an empire, something like a loosely federated entity, like Hungary was, or Austria-Hungary was, or like Yugoslavia was before that turned into a bloodbath, or any number of the other places. And you talk about empire and the old empires sometimes in various places, especially your blog. Our Caliph has elevated a new satrap.
Oh, yes.
That's Mary Simon has become our Governor General. So this, to me, is Trudeau's first signal of re-election. He has made a clear policy here, right on the heels of the unmarked graves. We finally have, no longer an Indian in the cabinet. He exited that, but we finally have a First Nations woman, an Inuk woman, in the Governor General's house.
Yeah, and you talk about this historical comparison, and I will take a moment to make it. I do think it's useful. So the Ottoman Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, old school empires, right? The more kinds of people you ruled, the more it redounded to the glory of the emperor, right? And so the job of an emperor was to fill his cabinet, to make his political appointments through tokenism. So, you might have the Caliph of the Ottoman Empire was, of course, a Turk, because it was a Turkish empire that was pulling resources out of the Arab and Slavic worlds and putting them into Turkey. And so in order to keep all the different peoples you governed under control and properly surveilled, of course, there would be an Orthodox Greek Christian in your cabinet. Of course, there would be an Armenian Christian. Of course, there would be one Jew. Of course, there would be an Egyptian Copt, right? And you would have all of these viziers. And the job of a vizier in these old school empires was to keep their people in line. They could dish out some patronage to those people, but in exchange, they had to keep those people in line. If they couldn't, they would be replaced. And the thing is, let me tell you, in the Nile Delta, when it was announced that, oh my goodness, the vizier in charge of wheat for the Ottoman Empire is a Copt, nobody put on a parade. The Copts weren't like, oh, great, Muslim supremacy is going to end. We've broken the glass ceiling. No medieval Coptic peasant thought that. They recognized that a representative can only represent the person who put them in power, right? You represent the people who voted for you or the people who appointed you. And so the point of your Coptic vizier was not to represent Copts to the Caliph, it was to represent the Caliph's interest to Copts. But we are so much less politically sophisticated than 12th century Egyptian peasants, right? We're like, oh my goodness, the glass ceiling is broken. Oh, yay, America's going to end racism and police violence because the corrupt cop, who's now their vice president, is a mixed race, dark-skinned woman. Like, that's a trick that was viewed as transparent and threadbare 2,600 years ago when the Persian Empire was appointing satraps in the Nile Delta. Like, tokenizing a member of a population you're trying to control is not that population winning. But there's so much historical amnesia and such a celebration of credulity and stupidity amongst progressives that, of course, people are like, oh, yay, yay, an Indigenous woman has been appointed to a powerless ceremonial position. We're on the way. Indigenous people see through this. There's no great fanfare on reserves. But I'm sure there was plenty of fluted champagne glass clinking in downtown Toronto as white people cheered each other over the appointment of an Indigenous Governor General. Now, I'm not saying this woman won't do some good. Governor Generals do have limited patronage power, and they're sort of similar to an American First Lady, right? You get to run campaigns about non-controversial things. So maybe this Governor General, right, will, she'll get to talk about, maybe it'll be nutrition, like balanced nutrition for kids or something. Like, I'm not saying she won't be able to do anything, but let's be realistic about the job. Let's be realistic about why she was appointed. Tokenizing minorities really works right now in this day and age because, as I said at the beginning, People don't want to have a conversation about the world. They want to have a conversation about the world. And this Governor General fits into that. Wait till they announce a couple $100 million worth of consultation with Indigenous people about why they keep getting killed. I'm sure we'll have that. We had that, of course, for 2 years in the first Trudeau government. And we had that for 2 years under the Harper government. Before that, it was Wally Opal's commission. We try to have a commission every 2 to 5 years, so we can keep ignoring the conclusions all the commissions have. We all know what's going to reduce Indigenous women and girls being murdered, and we've already decided we're not going to do it. That's why we're asking the question again. And this government will keep asking the question, because we've got to remember that public consultation is not merely useless. It is significantly worse than useless, because what it does is it redirects the energy of people who would otherwise be doing something useful into meeting with the government. So you just need to send out all these people with those little finger sandwiches and whiteboards and folding chairs, and you can occupy the volunteer hours. You can squander millions of volunteer hours of community activists that you can distract into meeting with you while you continue doing the things that they're trying to stop you doing.
Talk and log.
Exactly. It's talk and log, but it's now talk and everything. We've expanded that from a very successful set of tactics for tying up environmentalists in the 80s, and that game has gone pro. If there's any national game we're good at, it's consulting people and then round filing the results. I think that Canada has a lot to teach other fake democracies about how to distract people. And then you hear from like people, the government side, it's like, yeah, but this time we want to make people feel heard. And it's like, well, that's adding a level of complexity, given that you're not hearing them. It's very tough to make people feel heard if you've planned to not listen. So, but they're working on that. I'm sure there are people in a lab somewhere.
It is impossible to wake someone who is pretending to be asleep.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we got some difficult stuff ahead. Certainly this has been a difficult week on the climate front, a highly predictable week on the election front. We should probably say a few words about the insanity of the Green Party.
Sure.
Because they are... because, of course, I was subject to that Green Party boycott campaign, and a bunch of my guests from my radio show publicly denounced me and claimed that I said, various things on air that I hadn't said, because I gave the Greens a platform to talk about their internal party crisis. Well, what's great is it's getting clearer all the time. Now that Annamie Paul is like vetoing candidates all over the country, including in some of their strongest pickup ridings, and continues to stand behind the position that Paul Manley, one of her 2 remaining MPs, must be defeated. It's come out right that she wasn't getting an MP's salary. She was getting 2 MP's salaries. And they've now had to lay off half their staff as the donations dry up. And Annamie Paul continues to take in $20,000 a month personally on top of whatever her people are being paid. Now, my understanding is that they just want to be paid off. This is like the problem is the Green Party is already a grift, and her people are trying to grift the grift, right? They're trying to shake down the shakedown. And that's gotten very complicated because the Green Party has filled its national governing body with gullible idiots, because that was what was necessary for the party to function. So I was like looking at who the BC rep on their national council is. It's like, Oh, Bob Mackey. He's the guy who voted to give the money to the looters in the 2009 referendum and the 2018 referendum. This guy always gives money to looters. But the problem is that half of the people on the National Council have now figured out that these people are looters. The other half cannot accept that these people are looters. So I believe their National Council is split like 8-7 on whether to get rid of Annamie Paul. And of course, they need some ridiculous majority because they don't believe in democracy internally. They have all these high threshold decision-making processes. So the problem is, if Annamie Paul stays, what she's going to do is refuse to sign nomination papers in all their potential pickup ridings. That's how the shakedown will continue. But the problem is that the Greens don't recognize it's a shakedown. If they just paid her and her people off, they'd leave. But there are a bunch of people who are going to make up endless excuses for Annamie Paul's sabotage of her own party, and keep voting to keep her on. And the trick is going to be the Greens can survive this election only if the looters are somehow able to make their demands clear while not interfering with the personal narratives of these gullible personal narratives of the decision makers in their party. It's a little bit like that Yanucci movie, Death of Stalin, right? Death of Stalin's a brilliant film. And the central character is Molotov, one of the members of the Central Committee. And Molotov's wife, right, he denounced her. Apparently, she was like against the revolution. In one of Stalin's paranoid moments, he decided that Molotov's wife was counter-revolutionary. Molotov denounced her, and supposedly she was killed. Well, in fact, she'd been being kept in secret by Beria, the head of the secret police, and he gives Molotov back his wife in order to gain his allegiance. But the problem is that this destroys Molotov's theory of why Molotov is a good person. Molotov has been telling himself that he is so devoted to Stalin and so devoted to the revolution that he was willing to kill his wife over it. So the fact that his wife isn't dead really upsets him. And so he turns against Beria and supports Khrushchev. I think we have a similar kind of problem here. Everybody in the Green Party has a totally insane story of what they're doing there on the party's national board. And the trick is going to be which faction can tell a story that will pull a majority along. And it's going to have to be like a really complicated story. Because the story of we support the Palestinian people, that's not getting the job done, right? The pro-Palestine faction of the party, which may well be a majority of the party, that's not a compelling story for the other nuts. And they got to find a compelling story. Because there's such a culture of credulity in the Canadian Greens. So my bet is the Greens are going to lose Nanaimo. Because probably Annamie Paul will just refuse to sign Paul Manley's nomination papers and there'll be no Green candidate there. So the NDP will get their riding back. And I think in the Maritimes, there has been a real hit in the polls. People have really turned against the federal party. The loyalists of the provincial Green parties, I think you're going to see David Kuhn and Peter Bevan Baker being very gentle and kind to Jagmeet Singh. I was already starting to see that out of the PEI Greens even before I was denounced over. Actually, I was denounced because I said Annamie Paul was a looter, not because of the thing I was denounced over. But I think that Peter Bevan Baker and David Kuhn, they're popular provincial leaders who hold seats in their legislatures. Bevan Baker is the leader of the opposition. They are just, I think, going to quietly shake hands and do photo ops with NDP candidates. And the big maritime green project is going to collapse. My bet is that Jessica Antwin will lose her riding, though. I think it'll go Tory. I think that it's like David Emerson in Vancouver Kingsway. It was too much of a sucker punch for them to work so hard to get rid of the Tories in Fredericton, to get rid of Liberals in Fredericton, only to have them come back.
Well, we look forward to that with interest. And of course, when it comes to the federal election, they say it's anybody's game, but when you bet Liberal in Canada, that's usually the way to bet, unfortunately. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us again this week. We look forward to seeing you next Thursday as well.
Sounds great, Nathan. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're coming to the end of our hour here. We're actually right at the end of our hour, so we're not even going to bother with any kind of goodbyes and adieus. We got to go straight out. But hey, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain.